This is Booked on Rock. I'm Eric Senich. Our guest, Paul Brannigan, author of Unchained, the Eddie Van Halen story. Arriving in California as a young boy in the early 1960s, Edward Van Halen and his brother Alex were ripe for the coming musical revolution. The sons of a Dutch saxophone-playing father, the brothers discovered the Beatles, Cream, and others. And once Eddie switched from drums to guitar, it started to become apparent where the future of both brothers lay. From the moment their hugely influential 1978 debut landed, Van Halen set a high bar for the rock and roll lifestyle, creating an entirely new style of post-60s hard rock, becoming the quintessential Californian band of the 1980s. But there was also an undercurrent of tragedy to their story, as Eddie's struggles played out in public, from his difficult relationship with the band's original singer, David Lee Roth, to the band's substance abuse problems, and from the breakup of his marriage to Valerie Bertinelli to his long-running battle with cancer. With unique insights, Paul Brannigan's Eruption reaches beyond the boundaries of a conventional rock biography to explore the cultural, political, and social context that shaped an icon, while turning up the volume on a life lived in the fast lane. Paul Brannigan is a contributor to Rolling Stone, Classic Rock, Q, and Metal Hammer magazines. He's also the author of the acclaimed book, This Is a Call, The Life and Times of Dave Grohl. This interview is in conjunction with the Van Halen News Desk, which you can find online at vhnd.com. To hear a playlist of Van Halen, including the music discussed in this episode, head over to the show notes page. Paul, thanks so much for being on the podcast. Great to finally talk to you. You've been on quite a few interviews talking about this book, and we're really happy to have you not only on this podcast, but also we're going to put this up on the Van Halen News Desk.
Yeah, no, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me. And it's an honor. I have done quite a few interviews for this book, but it's always a pleasure talking to people who are interested and, as excited about music as, the community of ours.
You write in the prelude, it wasn't until he discovered rock and roll and the liberating potential of an over-amplified electric guitar that the young Eddie Van Halen found his voice and began to reimagine the world around him. He told Jazz Obrecht of Guitar Player in 1978, quote, "No one really understands what I'm trying to say." He seemed to communicate best through his music. It's what he preferred. Interviews were really not something he enjoyed. When you interviewed him in 1998, he had his own dictaphone on the table alongside yours. At the time, you thought it was because he didn't want to be misquoted, but you find out later he had one out all the time to capture the riffs and the musical motifs, which streamed unselfconsciously from his fingers as he spoke. That speaks to his genius. He himself could never explain where the music came from, but he was always ready for whenever it did, apparently, if he's got the dictaphone by him all the time.
Yeah, sometimes you hear, musicians say that, to say, well, I'm just a vessel for what's coming. The music is channeled through me, and, sometimes you can reach out and grab these notes, or, like you hear about McCartney talking about, yesterday coming to him in a dream or something like that. And then, with a lot of people, it sounds a little pretentious, let's be honest. But, I think that was genuinely the case with Eddie. And, maybe it is genuinely the case with other sort of genius level musicians. I didn't realize the significance of that really until I sort of read I think it was the Billboard interview with Chuck Klosterman, and which was maybe in about 2012 or something like that. And in that he admitted that, he didn't remember writing some of his best known hits. Some of those central motifs and some of those riffs were written while he was under the influence of alcohol or stronger stimulants. But that he always had a recorder with him, and he would sort of just capture everything that came out there and then sift through it later and sort of pick out the nuggets from amongst it. So yeah, that time when he had his interview his dictaphone sat on the table with me, it wasn't that he cared about being misquoted in a magazine he was probably never ever going to read. It was purely that when he could go back through that, if there was something that caught his ear and sprung out that could, lead to another classic, sort of riff, another classic song, which is something, when you read various people throughout sort of Van Halen history. I saw an interview actually on the Van Halen News Desk with Pete Angelus, and he said, Eddie was never without a guitar in his hand. He had it in his bunk on the tour bus. He obviously had it for sound check. He had it in the catering area. That guitar was sort of glued to his side from, essentially he was a teenager.
His parents play an important role in his life, and that was evident even more so, I think, in the books and the articles to come out since his death. Can you give listeners some background on his father, Jan, and his mother, Eugenia?
Yeah, well, I think they were a chalk and cheese sort of partnership, as so many sort of successful couples are. I mean, Jan was a jazz musician. He played a lot in sort of traveling bands, and him and his wife Eugenia actually met in Indonesia when Jan had initially a 6-week engagement out there to play music with a sort of a marching band, and he ended up, I think, staying maybe 6 years or something like that. And I think his Eugenia was probably initially a bit sort of suspicious about this, overseas musician. I mean, traveling musicians don't have the best reputation for fidelity, let's say, for one thing, or reliability to this day. And but they sort of fell in step together, and sort of the political circumstances in Indonesia changed, and they decided to go back to Holland to sort of, Eugenia was already pregnant with Alex, and decided to go back to Holland to raise their children there. Eugenia was quite a sort of, I think she was a very strict mom. She, wanted the best for her boys, and she wanted them in a straight and narrow because she could see what her husband was. I mean, obviously, the lifestyle of a traveling musician, it's a lot of late nights, a lot of nights away from home, for weeks on end on tour. And again, not the most sort of stable upbringing, or the most normal upbringing, I guess, compared to regular folk, in the neighbourhood. And Eugenia was very keen. First of all, she didn't want Eddie and Alex to have anything to do with music really at all. But she would occasionally sort of, when she was working evenings as a cleaner, she would sort of give the kids to Jan and say, "You're looking after these tonight," even if he had a musical engagement. And I think she thought that having the boys around would sort of curb some of Jan's more sort of hedonistic impulses. And it did nothing of the sort, but it did, in fact, sort of utterly sort of seduce Alex and Eddie, who were obviously thrown into this world with adults, and not the sort of adults who say, you can't do this, you can't do that. Adults who were like up for anything, liberated and imaginative and creative and whatever. And you can imagine how that environment was pretty appealing to a couple of young boys growing up, where of course you can drink, of course you can smoke, of course you can do whatever. You can swear, you can be yourself, basically.
I always thought it was interesting that it was the Dave Clark Five that sparked Eddie's interest in rock and roll, because the musicians from his era will always say the Beatles, the Beatles. They see him on Ed Sullivan, and that changed their life. Eddie found a magic in the Dave Clark Five's music that he didn't in the Beatles. I think that's interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting. Well, again, I think his initial attraction was the drums, and it was glad all over by the Dave Clark Five, and that sort of womp, 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 I guess, that, sort of appealed to him. And so I guess, a heartbeat, an alternate heartbeat, that sort of pulsed through him. And yeah, I mean, interesting, like most, particularly a musician is sort of prodigiously gifted as Eddie, you would think that the Beatles sort of have this sort of unending supply of inspiration. I mean, I was reading an interview with Brian May today, and he was talking about, for him, the Beatles were like the ultimate, and that literally you can never stop learning from the Beatles. There's so much in there that you'll always hear new things and always get inspired by new things. So you would have imagined that, I mean, along with the teeny boppers and, the people who were just into the Beatles for the pure, pop thrills, that, Eddie may have, as a musician, dive deep into their catalogue. But I guess there's so much going on, and he also already had a classical upbringing. So, the ideas that the Beatles were pushing into pop music, which were, more advanced, Eddie was already there. I mean, he was already learning Rachmaninoff and, these crazy Shostakovich and, these, Russian composers and rule breakers, from, previous centuries. So the Beatles sort of breaking out of the 1-4-5 chord progression wasn't, as mind-blowing to Eddie as it may have been to, a generation of other musicians.
As we know, we get deeper into the 60s, we have the band Cream and a guitarist by the name of Eric Clapton. The late 60s brought so many great bands and albums to the attention of teenagers around the world. Sgt. Pepper's, The Doors' debut, Hendrix's Are You Experienced, The Stones' Satanic Majesties, but it was Cream's second album, Disraeli Gears, that, as did the Dave Clark Five, grabbed Eddie like no other band or album. What was it that attracted him to Eric Clapton's playing?
I mean, I think it was the sort of the fluidity and the sort of the lyrical phrasing. But I mean, I've also seen interviews with Eddie and Alex where what they loved about Cream was that, you know, the musicians weren't hemmed in by the song. It wasn't about sort of keeping things down to that tight 4 minutes and that sort of formula. And the song was a sort of a launch pad, you know, it was a springboard for where they might go. So they might start off over here, and that was fine. They got that linear, and then they would just explode, and you wouldn't know where they were going from there. And then I guess all the sort of molecules would realign over on the other side here. I mean, I guess like The Fly or something when you know, Jeff Goldblum is vaporized, goes in one way, breaks down completely, and then comes out. I guess that was almost how they heard Cream, and it was that sort of, again, it was that freedom, that sense of liberation, that sense that anything is possible and that rules are there to be broken. You know, that's what they heard. Obviously, you had three incredible musicians in that band, sometimes sort of battling one another, sometimes sort of being supportive of one another. And I guess there was a sort of a good sort of mantra within that they understood as musicians.
Eddie and Alex went to see Led Zeppelin at the LA Forum. They were both fans. They had the 1969 debut album. And there's a moment during that Zeppelin concert that is a notable moment in Van Halen history. It came during Jimmy Page's solo for Heartbreaker.
Yeah, well, it was, you know, one of those moments. I mean, people will probably, sometimes when you think of a guitar player, you have sort of one image or one sequence framed in your mind. And a lot of people, when they think of Jimmy Page, they'll think of that sort of point where, you know, he's got one hand on the fretboard and the other hand sort of up in the air pointing. And, you know, it was quite a sort of I guess quite a basic and quite a sort of primitive form of the sort of, you know, hammer on and pull off technique, you know, one hand on the fretboard. But I guess Eddie saw that, clocked that, and, you know, saw there was something that there was potential in that. You know, that wasn't what it was limited to. It wasn't limited to where Jimmy Page could reach, you know, his stretch at that point. It was something that could be explored and expanded upon in his own home. And yeah, I mean, those Zeppelin concerts, you know, when people listen to the bootlegs, obviously, you know, incredible musicianship. Again, songs stretching out and, you know, really sort of going new places could go anywhere really from the sort of basic foundations. And again, that sort of sense of freedom in, you know, in the early 70s was just so sort of welcome for, you know, for teenagers who like to believe that they could do whatever the hell they wanted.
Eddie, Alex, David Lee Roth, and Michael Anthony all attended Pasadena City College. And this is around the time Dave and Eddie meet.
Well, actually, even before they got there, Dave had tried out for the band. He had tried out, you know, he had seen the band playing around. It was impossible not to see Van Halen playing around if you grew up in Pasadena and were a sort of teenagers, but they were playing so often. And, you know, word was getting around. And, you know, again, there was quite a few local bands were doing it, playing backyard parties and stuff. I mean, obviously, Greg Renoff's fantastic book, Van Halen Rising, goes into that in fantastic detail, and there's a wonderful book for anyone interested in that period. But, you know, Dave saw them at that point, and he, you know, I talked to people who knew Dave back then when he was a teenager, and Dave's nickname was Superstar, even back then. And he was essentially waiting for the world to catch up with his genius, you know. And when he saw Mammoth or Genesis at the time, I can't remember exactly which one it was. I mean, he basically saw his ticket out of there. He saw his ticket to the big time. Here was these, you know, local kids who were outstanding musicians and could do anything. And he obviously was a gifted, you know, singer-songwriter in his own right. But I guess sometimes when you see something that's like, no, this is special. This is the one. And he was on a mission to make these guys part of his life, supporting him, not over, you know, eclipsing him, obviously, God forbid. But he had two auditions, you know, for the band. You know, he showed up first time and with Eddie and I literally knocked on their door and said, I want to be the singer in your band. And obviously, you know, Dave was probably the best looking girl in Southern California at that point. So having him turn up at the door is like, okay, this could work, you know, even if he, you know, as long as he can open his mouth, this could work. But he totally failed the first audition. And Eddie walked out of the room in embarrassment because he could see it was a disaster, and he left it to Alex to break the news. But I guess Alex, again, being a bit more pragmatic perhaps than Eddie, sort of thought, well, hang on a minute, let's give him another chance. And, it's to Alex's credit, he sort of went through with him and said, how about you learn this song and come back? And maybe he thought that was more within his range. And Dave did come back, and he messed that one up just as badly. And so that was sort of the end of that. But I guess the good thing that came from those field auditions was that it really gave Dave sort of a kick in the ass and a motive to prove those boys wrong. So at that point, he formed Red Ball Jet as a rival band. And sort of his motivation at that point was really to tramp Van Halen into, the Van Halen brothers into the dirt and show them who the real kingpin of the local rock scene was. So sometimes you need to have, you need to be kicked down or have your face rubbed in the dirt a bit to give you the motivation, particularly if you're, a kid who's used to getting everything, as Dave pretty much was at that point.
Let's talk about those backyard parties. They were called Mammoth at this time. Their first backyard party with David Lee is in the summer of 1973. Some future well-known names in rock would see Mammoth play those backyard parties. One was guitarist Mark Kendall of Great White. What did he have to say about those shows?
I mean, he said they were just like mind-blowing. It was really interesting talking to him because, he was one of those people who, every time he opened his locker, there was 4 or 5 Van Halen or sort of Mammoth flyers falling out. And everyone was talking. His friend was going, you got to see this band, And eventually he learned that they were playing literally 2 blocks away on his street. And it was like, there was no excuse not to go. And he went, and he mentioned that the very first thing he remembers was Dave blowing into a tube to sort of affect the sound. I guess like a voice box thing for guitar, to affect the sort of tonality of Alex's drums. And I think we'll talk about that as well. That wasn't a unique thing, but I guess it was an unusual thing to see from a band. And he just remembered like this incredible guitar player. Obviously, he was a guitar player himself, and he was like, "Oh my God, this kid's amazing!" And he became a convert immediately and would go and see them as often as he could. And he said the depressing thing was like every time you saw Van Halen, you'd feel a bit inspired as a guitarist. You would go back home, you'd lock yourself in your room, you'd play for hours and hours and hours, and then you would go back out and see Van Halen again, and then Eddie would have jumped up another 10 feet into, further away from you.
You're right. It's a great point. That is a great point. Yeah, he excelled at the speed of light from the time he picked up the guitar to that first album. Because even the finger tapping and things, that was shortly before the first album. He was still progressing as you get right up to that first album.
Yes, and so Mark Kendall would say, you would look around that audience at the gig, and it would be every guitar player from the area, like everyone. He knew them all by their faces, and they would all be there trying to cop an idea of what Eddie was doing. But it was just, he said it was just dispiriting because you could never get there. And George Lynch was another sort of peer who said the same thing. Like, and in some ways, I mean, I sort of make this point in the book, and I guess it's a point it's somewhat peripheral to the Van Halen story. But there was also a generation of guitar players who saw Eddie Van Halen. They weren't seeing him in the backyard parties, but first time they heard that first Van Halen record, they essentially gave up trying to play hard rock guitar upon hearing Eddie, and they started doing something more punk, more sort of bit rough, bit more sort of less technical, less skillful. And that was how the alternative rock scene grew up for a lot of those guys. I mean, you talk to Stone Gossard, you talk to Tom Morello, you talk to Trent Reznor, all of those guys. Van Halen was a point in which, Kiss was the point that got them into guitar music. And Van Halen was a point where they stepped away from hard rock because they all heard Eddie and went, I can't do that. And just literally gave up on being that guy and decided to do something else.
There was one guy that was in the band with Ed, Dave, and Al that was not Michael Anthony in those early days. Can you talk about who was the bassist for Mammoth at that time and how Michael ends up filling out this classic lineup that we know of Van Halen?
Yeah, so at that point in the early lineup, it was a guy called Mark Stone. And I think that how he differed from the other guys, I mean, he was, I guess, a solid bass player, as is, what most people want from a bass player. If you've already got these sort of incredible musicians, you want something to anchor it. And Mark Stone was that guy, but he was also like an A student. And he was sort of learning, chemistry and microbiology or whatever. And, so he had classes to go to. He had other things, he had books to pour over as well as, copies of Playboy and Cream. So, that band were working so hard in those days. They were doing, 5 sets a night, 45 minutes to an hour each time, long, long nights, maybe, heading out, I guess, at, 7 p.m., coming back in at 3 or 4 a.m. And obviously, if you're trying to be a college student and keep up your grade point average, that's not, something's got to break at some point. But just as, as the band started, you talked about this, velocity, as the band started really picking up speed and picking up fans and picking up momentum, Mark Stone was he was trying to keep his own life, sort of steady to make sure that he had that thing to fall back on, which everyone's parents, every rock and roller's parents tell him to have. And I guess he was, I think the sentence I used, he was slipping at just the wrong time. But I mean, it wasn't that he was a bad musician or anything. He just had, 60 to 80 songs to learn per night at the same time, where he was obviously having to go through, his school books. How Michael came into the band was one of those little quirks of history where Michael's band Snake, it was a high school gig in Pasadena. Van Halen's PA, which was Dave's PA, blew out for the night, blew a speaker. And so they asked to borrow the support band, Snake's PA. And so Michael had to stick around watching them, and they had to be there to watch his band. And, there was obviously a sort of a mutual admiration sprung from that. And, I think, history sort of records that Michael spoke to Eddie afterwards and, just like casually chatting and, maybe we should get together someday to jam some tunes. And I think maybe, as teenagers, that's people that say that sort of thing all the time, and it's forgotten about. You meet a new girl, you find a new beer, and life goes on. But in this case, they called him up really quickly and said, "Do you want to come down and jam?" And that was, bye Mark Stone, sadly. And I think when Greg Renoff, I know, spoke to him for his book, and has been sort of quite generous in sort of like not rehabilitating his memory, but in sort of giving the guy the credit. He was there. It wasn't that he, it wasn't that he screwed up. It wasn't that he wasn't up to it. But, say different paths and different times in life, circumstances can fall your way or not.
And sadly, he passed shortly before Eddie passed away, because he was part of the history and is part of the history of Van Halen. And, another thing that's kind of emotional. Now, I got to admit, when I see these clips of Sammy and Michael's up there, he's now singing lead on Running with the Devil and Ain't Talking About Love. And Mike gets up there, he puts the bass up to his mouth, and he with his teeth, boom, boom, and starts singing Running with the Devil, man. It's knowing Eddie's gone and knowing that Van Halen, as we know it, is over. It's pretty emotional to see that. I'm going to go see Sammy in June. He comes here to Connecticut. Right. And it's going to be, we don't know. It could be the last time you ever see these guys, although Sammy seems like he's ageless. But, yeah, it's just... Yeah. It is pretty cool to see Michael up there still doing it. And it's tough because Michael really wanted to, it looked like it was happening. There was going to be that tour where Eddie was ready to give Mike a call and let's get back out there and do it right. And I think that's unfortunate.
Yeah, I know Van Halen fans have got a lot of sympathy for Mike Anthony. I guess maybe he seemed the most level headed of the four musicians, and maybe every Van Halen fan saw in Michael Anthony a bit of them. Like no one looks at Eddie Van Halen and thinks, I could be that guy. And no one looks at David Lee Roth and thinks, I could be that guy. Or, some people do, not everyone. Whereas everyone could see Michael Anthony and think, maybe I could have done that. That could be me. Not necessarily the best looking kid in the band, not necessarily the most talented person in the band, but the sort of the loyal, the believer, and, the one that every band needs, the anchor, in order to sort of push them forward. So, yeah, I think obviously, Michael himself, he said once Eddie wanted Wolfgang in the band, there was no debate after that point. He said, it's their band. If Eddie wants that, how's he going to argue against that? But, I know it's still, I guess it's one of those things that, in Eddie's history, that people will sort of maybe not give him a pass for, but they can't really understand what went down with Michael to see him push out, because he did seem a loyal guy and a good guy. But it's interesting, again, when I was researching the book, I mean, as early as Women and Children First, Eddie was complaining about Michael sort of living the high life essentially off Eddie's talent. He did an interview, it was with J.S. Albrecht for Guitar Player, I think, and he said, like there was, at one point, I think they asked about Dave's vocals and said, yeah, Dave did pretty good. I didn't think he did as good as me. And then Eddie said, but at least he sort of chipped in, whereas Michael, he's got himself a new car, he's got himself, a new house, and he contributes nothing. And so that was, I don't know how much people picked up on that at the time, but sort of reading it, back with the benefit of hindsight and the benefit of history, you can sort of see, that little irritation. That was the sort of grain of sand in the oyster right that early on that would, I guess, ultimately lead to Michael's dismissal.
And that was around the time Eddie gave his phone number to Billy Sheehan.
Yeah, I mean, I know when Billy Sheehan joined Dave's band, he rang up Eddie and Alex and was like, look, you guys cool with this? Because it's a bit awkward. And they were just like, go do your thing, man. It's a gig. You deserve a good gig. You deserve a spotlight gig. So, you've got our blessing.
Michael Anthony, his voice is part of the sound of Van Halen too. So important. The harmonies, that's part of that classic Van Halen sound. Yeah,
very much so. I mean, I think there's an interview that Dave did with a friend of mine, James McNair, and he talked about, how the band in the clubs, they were sort of listening to a lot of Motown songs and whatever. And he said, obviously, the Motown bands have got the horns, they've got the backing singers. He said, we were a 4-piece band, but we had to kind of replicate that somehow. And the only way we could really do that was with our voices, so we sort of all worked hard to sort of, fill in that space, and everyone had to sort of step up in terms of background vocals. And, sometimes when you listen to those, there's the sort of bootleg that emerged fairly recently. Well, it's been out there forever, but in a new version, recently, sort of Pasadena Civic Center, one from like 77 before the first album came out. And I mean, when you listen to that, the really good sort of soundboard recording, I mean, it's incredible how proficient that band were and how sophisticated melodically, they were. And to think that they hadn't even got an album out at that point, I mean, and they were playing to 3,000 kids or whatever. It's hard to fathom really in just sort of the context of today's music scene that the band would be out there playing to that many people with that level of skill and still be unknown to the world.
Yeah, and in defense of Michael's bass playing, because I think he's a great bassist, but even he said when you have Eddie playing guitar, you got to step back a bit. But I'll say one thing that's really cool. I put it up on the Van Halen News Desk recently. Somebody put on YouTube the isolated tracks of Diver Down, some of the tracks on Diver Down, and they did hang 'em high. And it's just Michael and Alex. And Michael can lay it down. He could play, but I think he pulled back more often than not because it really wasn't necessary when you got Eddie Van Halen playing guitar. But I mean, you can't have a Geddy Lee style or a Les Claypool style bass player, underneath Eddie Van Halen. It just wouldn't work at all. So, someone had to be the anchor and someone had to be the bedrock to allow the others to shine. You need that sort of solidity in a rock band. If everyone's going their own way, you're a jazz band, Yeah.
So someone's got to hold it together. And again, it's one of those that the sort of that lack of ego that a lot of bass players have, where they're like, okay, well, I'll be that guy. I'll be the rock, for this band.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. Talking with Paul Brannigan, author of Eruption, the Eddie Van Halen story. The band name Van Halen, that was Dave's idea.
Yeah, well, I guess everybody, who saw that band, we were talking about the backyard parties time. Everybody talked about the Van Halen boys, you're going to see the Van Halen boys, from then, regardless of the band name, because the band name, as we know, kept changing. So it was, to go see the Van Halen brothers. And I guess if that was already the sort of the trademark, and Dave was astute enough to realize that, that's what people talk about already when they see this band. It's Van Halen, so why not use that as a name? And, again, a nice selfless gesture for Dave, but Dave just, I think, a lot more canny and a lot more business minded and a lot more he did an eye and an ear for marketing, as we know, self-promotion for sure, but also, the band promotion. So it made sense.
He was thinking big picture. Yeah. And you would think a band with this talent would have been signed right away. Everyone in the Pasadena area knows about Van Halen and their guitarist, who is not of this earth, blowing people away, but they're not signed right away. Can you talk about Gene Simmons, what happens with him, and how they eventually are signed to Warner Brothers, thanks to Ted Templeman?
Yeah, so, Kiss were in Los Angeles to record a segment for the Paul Lynde Halloween special for, I think, ABC TV, if I'm correct. And I guess when they were there, they were talking to people like Gottlieb Biggenheim about, if we're going for a night out, who should we go check out? And the name Van Halen came up. And so Gene and Paul went to see the band at the club, and I'd also heard about George Lynch's band at the time, The Boys, and the two bands were together on the bill. So, they went down there with B.B. Buell and people like that, and sort of sat and watched The Boys, first of all, who were opening on this particular night, or at least maybe they were doing like a fluctuating two-set thing. And Paul and Gene were both sort of blown away by them. And, Paul Stanley said, like, that, the notes hadn't finished. Eddie hadn't set his guitar on the stand before Gene was in the dressing room, sort of sweet-talking them and seducing them. And, he offered to put them on his management company. He offered to make a demo with them. He gave Eddie his number at the Sunset Marquis Hotel and said, ring me when you get home. Ring me when you get back to Pasadena. And, to his credit, Gene booked Village Recorders. I think it was in Malibu, possibly, Santa Monica, I think. And they went there at like 6 a.m. the next day. Presumably they'd only got back to, Pasadena around 2 or 3. And they came back up there, and he started off doing a demo with them. And then when, Kiss were obviously booked to go back to New York to rehearse for a tour, they were in SIR studios in New York and Manhattan. And so he said, well, you come too. He booked them all flights, took them up to New York, had them finish off the demo at Electric Lady, and, introduced him to his manager. And he was like, well, I've taken this band on, and, I think we should work with them. And he absolutely couldn't understand why, Bill O'Quine and Paul Stanley were then like, I'm not really hearing it. Not really hearing what you're hearing, Gene. He's utterly flabbergasted. I think remains flabbergasted to this day. And I was like, what do you mean? How can you not think this has got potential? And and they just sort of said, no, not here. And Gene said, again, to his credit, he said, we were due to go off on tour. I ripped up the contract and said, look, I can't really, my hands are tied here. I can't do anything if these guys aren't into it. So, I'll release you from the contract. And when I come back off tour, if you're still not signed, I'll come and help you again. And so I spoke to Paul Stanley about this because, again, it's one of those things where, a lot of those demo tracks have never been officially released, but they're sort of leaked off the internet as a zero demo or, and different names given to it. And again, when you hear those songs, you think, how could anybody not be blown away by that collection of songs? But when I raised that with Paul Stanley when I interviewed him for the book, and he said, look, of course, Van Halen were incredible. Of course they were, just, a fabulous rock and roll band. He said, I saw that when I saw them in the club as well. And I heard it on the demo tape. But he said the reason that we turned down Van Halen was absolutely nothing to do with Van Halen and everything to do with Gene Simmons. He said, like, Gene, his personality is such that he gets distracted. He's like a magpie, gets distracted by this shiny little nugget. And at that time, Kiss had their own sort of turbulence going on. He said, we absolutely could not afford to have Gene being distracted by his new toy. We needed him focused for the sake of Kiss. So he said it was absolutely, nothing to do with Van Halen, everything to do with Kiss. And you could understand also at the time, there was a sort of again, they had an awareness of sort of record company business and record company politics. And even though in retrospect, people can go, well, Van Halen's a sure thing. How could that not work? Sort of a Led Zeppelin kind of template and, this excitement and, the energy in those songs. But I guess if the musical climate was such that it seemed that rock and roll was sort of being left in the past and everyone's getting excited with new wave, everyone's getting excited with disco, perhaps they could see that it was going to require a lot of time and a lot of money being invested, and that just maybe wasn't how they saw things, working out over the next few years, if that's the sort of feedback they were getting. Because obviously they themselves would sort of take a foray into disco before too long with I Was Made for Loving You. So, with hindsight, it's easy to, look back at that and think, what are you talking about? But being in their shoes at the time, you could see how, it was a bar band still, and it would require an incredible amount of investment to get them to the next level. And they had their own lives to live.
Which leads to Ted Templeman. How does Ted Templeman enter the picture?
So again, I think he was alerted to the band by Milton Berle. Milton Marshall? Marshall Berle, sorry.
Oh, Marshall Berle, yeah, and Mo Austin too, I believe.
Yeah, so he, Marshall Berle was a booker in Los Angeles in California, and that Pasadena Civic Center show I mentioned, he went down and saw Van Halen at that, and was sort of, he tells a story about driving down to the show and seeing all these kids and thinking, where are all these kids going? And he goes to the entrance Pasadena Civic Center, and they're like sold out. And he has to, sort of beg his way in through sort of the back door in order to see this band. And then he absolutely can't believe it, because he's expecting some sort of local band. He was thinking, what sort of idiot books a local band at the 3,000-seater theater? And was absolutely blown away. And he offered to help, but he got in contact with Ted Templeman because they had a relationship in the past, and said, look, I've got this band for you. And so Templeman sort of sneaked in kind of low key, one night just to watch the band play, and was obviously utterly transfixed. He's never stopped singing Eddie's praises. He talks about, sort of lining up Eddie with Charlie Parker in terms of like a genius, one of the most genius musicians he ever saw. And obviously at that point, he's like, he's like a head of A&R at the label. He's an executive, and he's got the power to sign whoever he wants. And he came back the next day and brought some of the Mo Austin, the big cheese at Warner's, brought him down with him, and was like, here you are, listen to this. And I think the two of them were sort of immediately, okay, right, yeah, this is what we want. And I guess people who know Ted's history, again, Greg Renoff did a fantastic book with Templeman for people who don't know his full story. But he had a successful, career as a musician, first of all. And one of the bands he produced early on was Montrose, featuring one Sammy Hagar. Another band with a killer rhythm section, fantastic singer, and a really like scorching lead guitar player. And made that first Montrose album with them an absolutely sort of essential hard rock document, and that record did nothing. It sort of just completely flopped, did absolutely nothing at all. The band broke up pretty quickly after the next record. And I guess for someone who'd always had a bit of a Midas touch in his career, as a songwriter and working with other people as well, I think that was a sort of a project that left a bit of a bruise on him, left him with a stain on his CV. So I think Templeman was probably looking for not another Montrose exactly, but another band roughly in that kind of ballpark that, he knew there was an audience for this sort of music if you got the right people and the right songs. And I think when he walked into that club in 1977, he saw, like John Landau talked about seeing rock and roll future when he saw Bruce Springsteen. I think Ted Templeman had the same vision when he first saw Van Halen. And
he was able to capture that live sound on that debut album from '78. It's one of the greatest in rock history. It is where we hear Eddie's now iconic finger-tapping style, and you write about the origins of this in the book. You mention names of guitarists who came before Eddie who are important to this story, like Roy Smeck, Jimmy Webster, Steve Hackett of Genesis, among others. Can you talk about those guitarists and how Eddie was able to take that to a whole new level?
Yeah, to be fair, I'm not sure how many of those, again, there's something sort of slightly revisionist about it. So I'm not sure how many of those guitarists Eddie would have been totally au fait with, if there's some Italian guitar maestro from, 1920, probably not going to be on Eddie's, there's no YouTube.
I was about to say, you stole my line. There was no YouTube back then.
It wasn't going to be something you were going to stumble upon, while going down a wormhole. But, obviously people like Steve Hackett and people like Jimmy Page, they had, an element of that in their sound. And I think there was another local guitar player called Terry Kilgore in the Pasadena area who had sort of started, playing about with that a little bit as well.
Who later played with Dave. He
every,
played with David Lee on the 1994 album, Your Filthy Little Mouth.
That's
and
right, yeah.
Yeah, some of the tracks on Dave's 98 album, too.
So, obviously, all musicians borrow or they get inspired by other people. So exactly where the sort of Eddie took that from, it may have been, I said, it may have been Jimmy Page, it may have been seeing Terry Kilgore doing it as well. It was a reminder of like, oh, yeah, there's that thing. And so, but, Eddie turned it into an art form, basically, the other people were sort of, I guess it was almost like learning a foreign language, and then Eddie comes out and he's fluent in it, and, famously he played initially with his back to the audience. So they couldn't quite figure out what he was doing. And, sort of jumping ahead a little bit, I interviewed Scott Gorham from Thin Lizzy, another great Californian guitarist, actually found his sort of fame and fortune overseas in London with Thin Lizzy. But he talked about going to see Van Halen in Detroit. And Thin Lizzy were on the same label, they were on Warner's in America. And Scott Gorham said how, the record company staff were so enamored with Van Halen, and also about, they'd go on the road with Van Halen, and obviously this was mind-blowing for a load of suits to suddenly be thrown into the, hedonism of the, 1978 Van Halen world. So Scott Gorham talked about how he's like, whenever we hooked up at Warner's, Phil Lynott would say to them, look, if you're going to talk about Van Halen, we're going to throw you off the bus. I'm sick of hearing about that band. It's all you guys talk about. Their curiosity was sufficiently piqued that they went to see them at the Cobo Hall in Detroit. And Scott Gorham tells a story. He was there with Gary Moore, a guitar player from Northern Ireland, actually, who was sort of in and out of Thin Lizzy, long history with the band. And they went there, and when Eddie started playing Eruption, Scott Gorham turned to Gary Moore and said, what is he doing? What is that? What's he doing? And Gary Moore's staring as well, and they're both, like staring at his hands, I guess, from row Z or wherever they were, trying to figure out what the hell how he's making these sounds. And Scott Gorham said, he carried on watching the show, and then about 10 minutes later, he turned around to say something to Gary Moore again, and Gary Moore was gone. And he's like, oh, okay, thanks for saying goodbye. I think people call it the Irish goodbye, which would be appropriate in this occasion. As Scott Gorham tells it, he said, so the next day they were, leaving the hotel, and Gary Moore says to him, Scott, come up to the room. And Scott Gorham's like, okay, we got to be on the bus, but whatever. And goes up to the room, and Gary Moore says, I figured it out what he's doing. And he, sort of picked up his guitar and was doing the two-handed tapping thing. And he was, so sort of mesmerized and sort of awestruck by seeing him, 12 hours earlier, that he literally sat in his hotel room all night, sat down and worked out methodically what he thought he must be doing, So I guess that was the sort of impact that instrumental had. And like I say, we talked about it before. People like Mark Kendall talked about it before, people with the rock musicians that came up in the 90s, that was possibly the most sort of revolutionary sort of guitar instrumental since, Jimi Hendrix did the Star Spangled Banner. I mean, it sort of reminds me a little bit of when Hendrix came to London, and Cream were playing, and Chaz Chandler brought Hendrix down to the thing, and he's talking to, Eric Clapton. He said, I've got this, cat come over, I found him in Greenwich Village. Is it okay if he comes up and, like jams with you in the last song or whatever? And Clapton's like, yeah, sure, let the kid have a go, And Hendrix gets up, does Hendrix things, and Clapton literally walks off the stage after him. He doesn't even say anything. He doesn't like elbow by the way. He just like sets his guitar down, walks off. And I mean, that same thing. I mean, obviously in a different caliber, but Hendrix had, within like weeks, he had Jimmy Page at every show. He had Pete Townsend at every show. He had Jeff Beck at every show.
Townsend was the guy who said, I was ready to just quit playing guitar altogether after I saw Jimmy play. It's the same type of deal. Yeah, Jimmy and Eddie are the two most innovative guitarists to ever come along. But, what is interesting, going back to Templeman, as great as Eddie was on that first album, Templeman knew from his experience with Montrose, you have to have a hit single. The first song has to be a hit single. He makes a specific choice for the first single. What was that first single and why?
So, it was obviously the Kinks, song. And what the good thing with that song was that Mo Austin had worked with the Kinks, and Ted Templeman was savvy enough to know. I think most had signed the Kinks, in fact, to Warner's in America. And so it was going to be one of those songs that sort of had an immediate resonance. So, you really got me. Obviously, an iconic song in its own right. When it became sort of Van Halenized, it was even more sort of irresistible. And, going back to sort of Hendrix once again, that sort of when Hendrix did All Along the Watchtower, everyone knows that's Dylan's song, but that sort of became Hendrix's song. And almost, you really got me almost to the same extent. When you hear the original now, it still sounds raucous and it still sounds dirty, but your mind automatically leaps to the Van Halen version. I think, anyone who's familiar with Van Halen. So, yeah, I mean, it sort of, it rubbed up against Eddie, maybe not immediately, but the idea of, having hits with other people's songs, he was on record saying, I'd rather feel with my own songs than have hits with other people's, as he sort of got further into the career. But, Templeman, like you say, he knew the business. And, sometimes it takes that sort of biting your lip sometimes and sort of listening to your elders, in order to get there. Because, yeah, maybe if they'd come out with, Atomic Punk straight off, the world wouldn't have been ready for that. They wouldn't have been able to comprehend that because it would have been such a leap ahead of what people's expectations were. So this was sort of something familiar that, people could get their heads around to start, but also something new. So as a sort of opening gambit, it was a really smart call.
Dave Davies of the Kinks, who came up with that riff, had a funny story about on tour in the early 80s. After the show, one of the fans comes up to him to get his autograph. You guys do a great cover of Van Halen's You Really Got Me. He just rolled his eyes like, okay. Yeah, that's how good their version was.
It's like Johnny Cash with Nine Inch Nails' Hurt. Yep. Sometimes someone does a version of a song and everyone just has to hold their hands up and go, okay, it's sort of not my song anymore. It's not your song either, but it's the world's song, out there. This is like...
You Really Got Me opens the door, and then you've got Running with the Devil, Ain't Talking About Love, Ice Cream Man, Jamie's Crying. They're all getting radio airplay. The album is a huge success. Eddie admitted to Guitar World that he felt a lot of pressure heading into that second album in 1979, but as we know, he comes through with another batch of classic songs. Dance the Night Away, top 20 single, Beautiful Girls, another VH classic.
That turnaround, I mean, they literally sort of had about 6 days break between the end of the First World Tour and going back into Sunset Sound. But what people might not sort of know is that in their contract, they had to deliver 2 albums within a 12-month period, which is insane. And obviously, even as successful as they were, I mean, that the First World Tour ended with them getting presented with gold and platinum discs at a party in LA. But even though Templeman was their guy, he still was cracking the whip, and he still had them back out there. So, and I think it's interesting as well with Van Halen 2 is that there's so much sort of new material on it because they, like going back to the Gene Simmons demo tape, there's so many unreleased Van Halen songs from that period that they could have just said, well, we'll just use the second, we'll just use all of them we didn't use on that. But they didn't do that. They sort of dug deep again and we're still writing. And obviously, bands write stuff on the road, but again, it shows that sort of we're resting on their laurels and we're still trying to sort of push forward and we're still trying to test themselves and perfect the art, and Van Halen 2 is such a great album, and it's sort of almost unfortunate that it falls after Van Halen 1 because Van Halen 1 is sort of the meteor that, it's the sort of the big bang for that band, and sort of there was nothing they could have done afterwards that could have eclipsed it really. It had to be a consolidation really rather than like another revolution because it just would have been too much. The world was still catching up with Van Halen 1 when Van Halen 2 was out there.
There's so many good songs.
Yeah, I mean, really one of the most sort of underrated sort of Van Halen albums, say, just because of where it falls in the lineage, I think. And, it's an album that really stands up on its own merits, like you say. I mean, there are no duds on that record. It's, again, it's a flawless collection, but I say it's just, inevitably going to exist in the shadow of Van Halen 1.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. The next album is 1980's Women and Children First. In The Cradle Will Rock, Everybody Wants Some, Romeo Delight, a classic Van Halen song, Take Your Whiskey Home. They go out on a headlining tour in 1980, the World Invasion Tour. This is where the brown M&M story comes in. Dave intentionally put it in the rider that no brown M&Ms be backstage. He knew that if there were brown M&Ms there, chances are they weren't paying attention to every detail on that rider, and something could go wrong. And sure enough, it did. Can you talk about what happened on that first leg of the North American tour? This takes place in Colorado.
Yeah, so I mean, essentially, the promoter in this case hadn't read the small print, and the band were traveling with this huge sort of lighting rig and huge production, and they're setting up in a sort of a hall. I guess it wasn't necessarily used to staging major level, international level rock shows, and essentially the whole thing came crashing down. And I mean, like you say, everyone always thinks of that sort of the Brian M&M story as a diva story, as one of those things where it's like, how out of touch is this, rock band, these superstars, that they want this one thing that they don't particularly like the taste of. But it wasn't that at all. It is about, the attention to detail. And, it's a smart move because, someone could have died under that rig. The story you could have been reading there is, Van Halen tragedy on stage. And, again, Dave, big picture, but also got an eye on the, every little, the mechanics, the nuts and bolts of what it takes to have a rock band out there. And I mean, I actually like this story where before the US festival, that the promoter there, obviously they've sold 375,000 tickets or whatever it is, and he comes into the dressing room with a bowl of brown M&Ms as a sort of a little knowing in joke, and a kind of like, not only have I read this, but I'm so confident that everything's that this is your day, that here's an entire bowl of them. So I thought that was a smart and clever little reference from them.
Well, we know Valerie Bertinelli showed up with a bag of M&Ms one night. This is in your book. This is where Eddie meets Valerie. She shows up at a Van Halen gig on August 29th, 1980 in Shreveport, Louisiana. Shows up with a bag of M&Ms. Instant chemistry, right?
Yes. So, I think they obviously did the sort of, photo, whatever they were chosen. I mean, the only reason Valerie was there was because her brother wanted tickets for the show. And I guess, a supportive family, she's like, what, I'm going to throw you a bone. Yeah, I'll go along to this, And, she'd sort of like checked out the picture of the band on the album sleeve. And I think, guitar players, pretty good. But then, she obviously got to stand side of the stage. She was standing on Eddie's side of the stage and saw, the magic close up. And I guess, again, when people think of Eddie Van Halen, they think of that smile. What a sort of devastating, charming, sort of, inviting smile it was. You just looked over, this is a guy having time of his life, and sort of how, obviously, Valerie used the spotlight herself, but just seeing how intoxicating that was, in front of whatever it was, 5,000 to 6,000 people that night, all cheering her name, the sheer joy of Eddie's playing, the talent of what he's doing, the magnetism of on stage. And I think pretty much love at first sight. And, I mentioned this is, one of the things when I sort of mentioned about people saying that I'm a bit of a downer on Dave, was I sort of pointed out that, there was sort of a bitterness when Dave was writing Crazy from the Heat. And he sort of, essentially he passes it off as like, well, I wouldn't have given her a second glance, so therefore she went with Eddie. And I think that's, again, a sort of a rewriting of history somewhat. I don't think Valerie had any interest in Dave whatsoever, and you sort of look at Eddie and Val in those sort of early photographs, and they just look like two halves of a man. They're the Ken and Barbie of sort of Hollywood rock. They look so perfect together. So Dave's version of history might be that he, Val was not doing anything, wasn't floating his boat, shall we say. But I think Val only from the moment she sort of stepped into that venue only had eyes for Eddie, and vice versa from the moment that she stepped into his dressing room.
This is also around the time Eddie became frustrated with Dave and Ted Templeman too. He was feeling creatively frustrated, kind of felt boxed in. In 1981, the band releases Fair Warning. This includes Mean Street, Dirty Movies, So This Is Love, hear about it later, and what Eddie called the definitive rocker, Unchained. This is when he and engineer Don Landee are sneaking into the studio when his bandmates and Ted Templeman weren't around.
And yeah, I mean, and I guess it's, it's one of those things where it shows about Eddie, speaks to Eddie's perfectionist eye as a, not perfectionist eye, but his sort of, much of a musician that he was. Everyone else is getting distracted, as is entirely understandable, by the sort of periphery of the rock and roll scene, by the trappings of success. Everyone's living the life, and Eddie's still like, no, this needs to be done. Everyone else, I guess, you can imagine at the time people, even Templeman was probably easing off a little bit. He wasn't cracking the whip quite as much as he was, because everyone's on the gravy train, everyone's on the roller coaster, and everyone's just, living their life. It's how they react with that. But Eddie was still like, no, this needs to be done, and I want this how I want this. So, yeah, as much as he was able to enjoy the lifestyle, as much as the rest of them, he had that sort of focus and that determination that he wanted sonically. He wanted these songs how he heard them in his head. And again, yeah, like another thing, it's another thing that leads up to the split. I mean, I mentioned earlier, he said, I'd rather have a lot of feel with my own songs, than do covers of others, because it was becoming a bit of a formula. And he wanted to sort of, take back the reins of control. And, fair warning, what a great album, for guitar players, particularly, again, hugely underrated. Again, so many great songs, so much invention going on, and that, and I think that the engineer who worked on the album was saying, it was a different kind of thing, even from, Women and Children First. There was that sort of, it was much more sort of free and easy and going in there. But by fair warning, like Eddie was on it. He was starting to layer things. He was starting to really pay attention to the sort of, yes, people call it the sort of ear candy, with what's going on in the background, on multi-tracks, to make sure everything was exactly how he heard it in his head. And yeah, one of those times where the sort of the divide between the sort of musician side and the sort of rock and roll side of the business is coming in, and the fractures are starting to appear between Eddie and Ted and Eddie and Dave.
How about, did you hear Dweezil Zappa mentioned Unchained was written on the piano? Did you hear that?
I did not. No.
Wow, yeah, I heard that, and I was like, man, I'd love to hear that if that's somewhere on a demo tape in the 5150 vaults. You were in those vaults, yeah. Paul. Did you sneak around, look around for anything? Did you grab anything?
I wish I had.
If you did, you weren't going to admit it here. That's for sure, right?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that, I sort of mentioned when I've been doing these interviews, I say, obviously, I've written this book, and because of the timing of it, it is the, sort of the first Eddie biography that sort of birthed to death. But I said, this is where that story might end. But the Van Halen story for me isn't going to end, because Wolfgang has obviously got the keys to that vault. And, who knows what, like I said, talked about at the start with that Eddie tape recording, just his playing during my interview. I mean, there must be literally tens of thousands of hours of music in some form in those vaults. And, I guess the hope, it would be amazing if, Wolfgang goes into those vaults and pulls out a selection of music that completely sort of revises people's opinion of what his father was as a musician as well. Because you can imagine there's stuff on there that wouldn't have sat on a Van Halen album ever, but that, is just this sort of, maybe Alan Holdsworth sort of inspired, maybe, going in some other direction. And, hopefully Wolfgang, obviously with a musician's ear and obviously the greatest respect for his father's legacy, might be able to go in there at some point and just, pull out a collection of music that will show his father's incredible talents in a whole new light. I mean, that would be wonderful to hear.
We'll see what happens. He has said recently he's so busy with Mammoth WVH that he's leaving it to Alex at this point. But I'm sure he's going to have his
understandably
input.
So. I mean, I think it's, Wolfgang's obviously, he's living his own life. And, again, we touched on earlier about his sort of reactions to, social media comments and stuff, and how he's been very much really sort of absolutely steadfast and single-minded and saying, look, I'm my own man, and people have been saying to him, well, couldn't you just honor your father's legacy by, playing Panama one night or playing, just occasionally? And he's like, look, by doing this, I'm honored every day that I take a breath. I'm honoring my father's legacy, and I'm particularly honoring my father's legacy by living my life. The last thing Eddie, I imagine, would have wanted from his son was to have him going out being a tribute band. I can understand. We talked earlier about the emotional sort of aspect of people almost sort of they haven't had that closure. Almost with Van Halen, because the death was so sudden and unexpected. And you're talking about when you go and see the Circle and hearing those songs again will be hugely emotional. So you sort of get why people want to sort of cling on to the memory, and they say Wolfgang's the person who should be that guy who does that. But like you said, it's just him being out there and being his own man. That Eddie never was one to he never wanted to follow in anyone's footsteps. He always wanted to walk his own path, and that's exactly what Wolfgang's doing. And people should hopefully see and hopefully will come to appreciate that. That's probably the greatest tribute he could pay to his father.
Absolutely. Follow up Women and Children first with Diver Down, and this is where Eddie starts playing with his own new toy, a synthesizer. He came up with the music for Jump around this time, but the thought of Eddie, the guitar god, playing keyboards? No way, says Dave. But Eddie's day would come, only not on the next album, Diver Down. This album is underrated in that Eddie gives it the thumbs down a lot because of the amount of cover songs on there. Pretty Woman, Dancing in the Streets, but there's some really good originals on here. Hang 'Em High, Secrets, Little Guitars. Eddie's brilliant on these tracks, and so are the rest of the guys in the band. I mean, I was talking about those isolated tracks that went up on YouTube. There's some really good songs on here.
Yeah, I mean, probably the most underrated album in the Van Halen catalog, I think they would say. And, obviously it's a short album. Obviously there are a lot of covers on there. But, it shows so much sort of versatility within the band and shows their sort of capabilities. And, I'd say it's sort of ironic that, you listen to that album and it sounds like a band with not a care in the world, that they're sort of making it up as they're going along, which is obviously, not the case. I mean, that album was never meant to exist in a way. Eddie only did Pretty Woman as a sort of way to get Warner's off the band's back, to a certain extent. It was like, okay, well, I'll give you this, and then, we want a year off. But then, obviously, that was the most successful Van Halen single, so suddenly Warner's are like, now you're right back in people's faces again. We want another record. So, an album made under duress, to some extent. And again, they could have taken the easy way out. They could have said, look, there's 40 tracks that we have demoed, from Cherokee Studios on our own right through to the Gene Simmons demos. Why don't we just pull out those songs, stick them on there, easy, job done, in and out in 2 days. But no, they did try different things, and it's sort of a measure of their their professionalism and their sort of pride in the band that they would go and try some different tacks and try some different things.
Paul Brannigan's Eruption, the Eddie Van Halen story, which is out now. You can get it at the Van Halen store, vanhalenstore.com. After Van Halen headlines the US Festival September of 82, the plan is to get to work on the next album, but much to the surprise of Templeman and Dave, Eddie builds his own studio, 5150, with the help of Don Landee. Don came up with the name of 5150, and it seemed fitting based on what Eddie's bandmates thought of him wanting to build his own studio. Where does this name come from, 5150?
Well, I mean, it's sort of like the like an American police code for I believe, like an escaped mental patient, someone who's escaped from some asylum or an institution. And I think that it was a joke that Don Landee came up with, sort of because everyone was saying that Eddie was crazy for building his own studio. They couldn't understand what he was up to. They just thought he was going on some weird Howard Hughes trip or something. And I think it was Don Landee who sort of coined the phrase. Sort of that's why they had it. It was like an in-joke between him and Eddie. But I guess at that point it was a real sort of declaration of independence from Eddie. It wasn't about bricks and mortar. It was about saying, I don't need you, to Templeman, or indeed almost to the whole band, at that point. Obviously Alex was always going to be on board, but it was Eddie sort of stating his territory, like this is my band, this is my sound, walling it off within those sort of studio walls. And I know Templeman obviously is someone who he's got this, like not only has he got a sort of great ear for a tune, but he's, a sort of a technical, an expert on sort of, technicalities of the studio. And, I guess there was a certain reluctance, as much as he trusted Eddie and as much as he was in awe of Eddie's musical talents, he could see that this place wasn't going to match up to the sort of sonic capabilities that they had in Sunset Sound. So, I think Templeman is on record as saying he was, pretty reluctant to let Eddie sort of run with this idea of having it in his own place, because he would go up there and he would see that the studio just wasn't finished. It just wasn't ready, for like an international sort of standard they had to be at. But I guess, it's one of those things where, again, you sort of bite your lip and keep the talent happy. And I guess Templeman probably thought, well, I can fix it up, later if they come back to me. Don Landy's always going to get a great, capturing stuff on the tape. So I guess he thought, well, if it's not up to scratch, I'll polish it up at Sunset later. But, for Eddie, it was, so like I say, one of these things where it was like, I don't need anyone else. I'm self-sufficient at this point. I can do it all. And again, it was another, you can see it with hindsight as another sort of fracture in the unit. Again, with with Templeman, who was the band's biggest sort of cheerleader, and with Dave as well. And, the sort of history records that, during the making of that album, like Eddie was locking himself into the studio for days on end. Valerie was, ringing up, Templeman and ringing up management and going, look, I haven't seen my husband in 3 or 4 days, and that, I can't get through to him. I'm ringing the studio and no one's picking up, blah, blah. It is, Eddie was obsessive, there was obviously leaning quite heavily, I guess, on, certain stimulants at that point, which were only sort of accentuating his sort of obsession with getting the perfect sound and, what he heard in his head. And, there was a lot of, it's on record, there's a lot of cocaine floating about, there's a lot of alcohol floating about. And it was becoming increasingly hard for anybody to get through, even the band members. They didn't even, they were getting locked out of the studio until Eddie clicked his fingers and had them up there.
There are stories of Dave and Ted Templeman just literally hanging out outside the studio waiting, like, just, he's going to come out any minute, and doesn't come out. They're just waiting.
It sounds laughable, but you can sort of hear, you can understand it from both. You can understand from both ends. Maybe less from Eddie's end, but he's sort of so deep in. It's that sort of what's the Heart of Darkness, Apocalypse Now, where the guy gets sort of so absorbed into the sort of what he's doing that he sort of loses all trace of or contact with reality. To a certain extent, you're in that blizzard of stimulants, and you're in that sort of world of sound. You're in the headphones, you're in the moment, and you're just obsessed with getting it. And even to sort of to step away out of the process for 10 minutes was going to seem like maybe it was all going to come crumbling down, and in Eddie's head, in his sort of wired state, in his obsessed state. So sort of laughable on one sense, but also another sign of just how sort of absolutely dedicated and obsessive a sort of creative Eddie was.
The mad scientist was at work, and the vindication, it would come. The song Jump goes to number 1. Band is bigger than ever. Album goes to number 2. Panama, Hot for Teacher. I'll Wait. Huge singles. Drop Dead Legs. Top Jimmy. House of Pain. Girl Gone Bad. It just took them to a whole new stratosphere. But then Dave is out a year later. And what's interesting is even while Dave was promoting his debut solo EP, Crazy from the Heat, and the California Girls single, he was stating publicly that he was not going solo. Van Halen with Dave would continue. You even quote him from that appearance on David Letterman, January of 85. And that's on YouTube. You can watch it. He says the band is still together, planning the next album. So what happens between then and the summer of 85 when he's out and Sammy Hagar is in?
Well, obviously the success of that EP was maybe something that no one really quite expected on that sort of level. One of the sort of interesting things about that EP is like, why would Warner's and why would Templeman have let Dave make that record? It seems, again, with retrospective of hindsight, it seems insane that you've got this band who are absolutely the peak of their powers, and you let the singer go off and do something which, it's part of the flavor, I guess, of Van Halen, you could argue. But it seemed like and I think maybe in retrospect that was Templeman's way. If 5150 was Ed's way of saying, I don't need any of you, maybe the Crazy from the Heat EP was Templeman and Dave's way of saying, well, you know what, Eddie? We don't need you either.
That's an interesting way to look at it, because you know, Noel Monk, the band's manager, said Dave was playing these songs on a tape for Eddie on their plane coming back from the very last show, that Monsters of Rock show, I think, or Germany, wherever they were.
Yeah, I think they actually played it when they were about to fly to England.
Yes.
He played California Girls, and Eddie's like, he's thinking like, what, do you want to cover the Beach Boys now? And then Dave's like, no, it's it's me, I'm doing it. And that's, as they're about to fly to Europe for those Monsters of Rock shows, what would end up being their final shows. And you can imagine Eddie's mind as he sat on that plane, on that flight, that 10-hour whatever flight to England, thinking, what?
Yeah.
And also like you can imagine the sort of rage he had with Templeman, thinking, what? Why is this happening? Why are you supporting this? It seems like, so the only sort of way I can read it, I mean, obviously you want to keep everybody happy. So say like Templeman was prepared to go, okay, have your studio and whatever. And so maybe in that same way, this is a band with essentially two frontmen. Maybe in that same way, he's like, okay, Dave, go and make your little EP, and then we'll get that out of the way, and we'll all regroup, and everyone's happy, everyone's got their ego stroked, and then we can get back, and we can
keep in mind, you had Genesis and Phil Collins. They were able to do that. Everything was cool. Phil did his solo album, went back to maybe they were thinking that it was going to be the same type of situation, but not the case.
But then obviously it blew up so much, and it became this whole other thing. And I guess when as sort of ridiculous as it might seem to people who are like diehard Van Halen fans, there was probably, hundreds of thousands of people, if not millions, who heard those songs and didn't even know that David Lee Roth was the singer of Van Halen. They just saw this sort of blonde bombshell, entertainer, vaudeville kind of guy. You see Californian Girls, you see the songs like that in the videos, and you might not even make the association. If you're like, if you were like a teenager who's grown up in an entirely different world, if you were in the Culture Club and Police and Flock of Seagulls world, maybe you didn't know that Van Halen had got 6 albums, but you saw that guy on Never off MTV, and that was a whole new, like, whoa, who's this guy? It opened up their audience so much, and you can understand how at that point, with all that was going on, with Eddie's sort of increasingly, I guess, control freak tendencies emerging in the studio, you can see why Dave, with his own ego, is suddenly thinking, or not even suddenly, but is thinking, actually, I don't need you either. These people are here for me, and they will be here. They're not here for me based on Van Halen songs. They're here for me doing on exactly whatever the hell I want to do. So,
and he was the biggest front man in rock at that point.
Yeah, I mean, he was the face of, he was the face of the band. He was the face of sort of hard rock worldwide. I mean, obviously at that time, you've got Springsteen, you've got Madonna, you've got Prince. It's an incredible sort of era for music. But if anybody was sort of thinking like, if you had to put a face on rock and roll in 1984 or 1985, that face is David Lee Roth's face. Like there is no one else.
So it never was an official announcement. It was just a quote from Eddie in Rolling Stone. An "oh, by the way" quote, just in this small little blurb in Rolling Stone when we hear the official news, quote unquote, from Eddie, right? He said, Dave's gone. Yeah,
well, I guess, it was sort of very much a sort of a Hollywood split, because, the EP is then followed by Dave getting a movie deal. And, I sort of mentioned in the book, when you read the synopsis of what that movie was supposed to be, it's sort of horribly dated and out of time. And even at the time, you can't imagine that it made an awful lot of sense to people. But again, it's a superstar vehicle. You've got this guy, everybody in America knows who this guy is. He can write the trashiest film script in the world, and there's still going to be people coming out to see it. And because he's shown what a magnetic performer he is in the videos, and he's shown, he's able to go onto live TV and be, the greatest sort of comedian and heartthrob. He's everything rolled into one. He's a sort of dream package. So I guess people were going to let him make that movie, and then this is only rubbing Eddie up the wrong way even more. So, I think Dave maybe was like, let's get back together once I've done my movie. And then he's like, expletive deleted you. There's no way I'm waiting around for you. Who do you think you are? And I mean, I guess I can imagine, without sort of being there, but again, it's one of those decisions that's fueled by being on a certain drug at a certain time. And, your own ego is such, you're like, he said what? He's telling me what? And just like, if calmer heads maybe had prevailed at the time, maybe everyone was so caught up in this blizzard, it should be one of those things that maybe that Mo Austin, if Templeman was too close to it, maybe Mo Austin should have said, look, let's get in the room here. I see where you're coming from. I see where you're coming from. Take 9 months out. Enjoy yourselves. You've been going at this for, 5-6 years without a pause. Take some time out. You go do your family thing. You go do whatever you want to do. Let everyone have the time off. Let's get back in this room in 6 months' time and we'll start again. But hindsight's a wonderful thing. When the train is rolling, everyone's, clinging on for dear life, and it doesn't always make sense to pull the brakes and pull into the sidings for 6 months.
Was it August of '85 that quote came out from Eddie in Rolling Stone? I believe it was August.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a sort of a version of history that says it was officially April 1,
Which
when
is not true.
When Dave left, but I don't think that's true. But it's just a convenient, date that people have sort of landed upon. But yeah, I mean, you say, when you follow the story, you can see those fractures happening all along. From there were fractures before the start. And it was just only getting wider and wider. And, two guys with huge talents in their own way, you can see where both of them thought, well, okay, let's give this a shot. You think you can do this without me? Go ahead. You think you can do this without me? Go ahead. And maybe in both their minds, there was a certain amount of like, well, we're blowing off steam, we're fronting here, and then we'll do our thing and we'll get back together.
And then there's a question.
So.
Is it possible for someone to be destined to pair up with more than one person in their life? I'd like to think that Dave and Ed were meant to join forces. As for Sammy, it might be the same. The powers that be at Warner Brothers had considered Sammy to front the band back in '78, but it didn't happen. But about 7 years later, they finally connect.
Yeah, and it's interesting when I talked to Sammy about this. He said, I knew I was going to get that call. He said, at the time, he said there was only 3 people in the world who could have stepped up to front that band. He said there was Ozzy Osbourne, there was Ronnie James Dio, and there was me. There was like 3 vocalists with the sort of the profile and the ability to step into that band. He goes, look, Eddie, Ozzy, you just can't imagine Ozzy in Van Halen. I mean, it's literally laughable. Ronnie James Dio as well, absolutely not the fit. I mean, incredible singer, but he's not going to fit in Van Halen. So that left 1. So, Sammy said, essentially he was saying I was sitting by the phone waiting on that call. I think he was supposed to go in Japan, to a tour in Japan, and that got cancelled for some reason. And he, as he tells it, and again, people can be economical with the truth to some extent, but as Sammy tells it, he was basically just waiting,
But he was also ready to retire, he said. He was pretty much done. He said he was ready to call it quits.
Yeah, I mean, I think he just got a bit comfortable. Sammy said himself, that he always worked best when he'd got a bit of a fire in his belly and a bit of a need to prove people wrong, and that he was on a bit of a roll at that point, and was doing arenas in every city, was selling records. He'd got the houses, he'd got the cars, he'd got everything he wanted, and he said like this was something that it was like, okay, well, this could be different. This could be the kick in the ass that I need right now. And he sort of freely admitted that. He said that's, I was looking for a new challenge, and Eddie provided that.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. Instant chemistry with Sammy. They start working on those songs that would make up 5150 from 1986. Dreams, Why Can't This Be Love? Love Walks In, Summer Nights, the title track. The album goes to #1, their first #1. They proved the doubters wrong. There were those behind the scenes who wanted the band to change their name to Van Hagar. Where do you stand on that? Was it the right decision to keep the name Van Halen?
I think it was absolutely the right decision. I mean, it'd be like somebody coming up to, Coca-Cola and going, hey, what do you guys think about changing the name for the 90s? Is that going to work out for you? I mean, it was absolutely the right name. The idea of like Van Hagar is a convenient sort of title to separate the 2 eras of the band in people's mind, but it was absolutely the right decision to keep the band name. But they almost, in a way, it almost is 2 separate bands. It's like obviously the continuity is there, but the sophistication of the songwriting and the melodicism, and it's a different thing. I spoke to Sammy, about sort of the songwriting of that. And he goes, there was such a sort of a distance, between these little punks screaming in Pasadena and what we were sort of doing, by the time of 51, 50, 08, 12. He said, I don't think they could have done that with Dave in the band. And I think that was what was so refreshing for Eddie in particular. Suddenly he had, not a musician who was on an equal footing with him perhaps, but someone who could translate all his ideas, the sounds that Eddie heard in his head, vocally and whatever. Sammy could do everything, and they're sort of all on the record. It's basically saying like it was such a honeymoon period because, Eddie would throw something out, Sammy would go, okay, well, how about I do this? And everyone would be like, oh my God, you can do that. And, I think some of the sort of schism between the Dave camp and the Sammy camp came out of the interviews that were done at that time, because I think Eddie was just being honest, saying, I don't think Dave could have done what Sammy can do, and Sammy was obviously saying the same, and you can see that as a bit of a kick in the teeth to the history, and the legacy it's gone before. People are like, might have seen it as disrespectful, but I think it was an honest musician's assessment of where they both were at in terms of pure musicianship. I think Sammy, he didn't have that sort of big picture vision of everything that Dave did, but he didn't need to, because he had the chops. He had already got a background of his own, and so he didn't need to be the sort of working with Pete Angelis on crazy video concepts. He was a working musician, and that's what he brought to that band.
They had a great run with Sammy. OU812 from 1988. That's got When It's Love, Mine Oh Mine, Feel So Good, Cabo Wabo, Black and Blue. We know 1991's For Unlawful Carnal Knowledge was another success. Right now, Pound Cake, Top of the World, 3 straight #1 albums, and they make it 4 in a row with 1995's Balance, which is often overlooked, but I love that album. Seventh Seal, Don't Tell Me What Love Can Do, Amsterdam, Not Enough. Throughout those years, that was when I became a fan, was during the Sammy years. And if I had to pick an era, it's the Dave era by a close margin. But seeing how tight the band was with Sammy, I just assumed it would never happen, that he would be out and Dave would be back. But it happened. What caused Sammy's fallout with Eddie? It all started with the death of their manager, Ed Loeffler.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was sort of one of the things, because obviously then a lot of responsibilities then fell on Eddie and Alex, and he was already, I guess, trying to deal with a lot and wasn't necessarily prepared to have all that on his shoulders. But I think, I mean, it's in, we talked earlier about the Inside magazine. There's 4 pages in that issue of the magazine dedicated to like a almost daily account of the breakdown. And it's such a sort of paper cuts kind of, it wasn't that big sort of fracture. It wasn't a big sort of earthquake rift where, the sort of tectonic plates shifted. It was paper cuts. It was just like little things like, oh, why are you doing that? And, what's up here? Like there's Sammy wanted to do a greatest hits record, I think, himself, and, maybe wanted to do another solo album, and Eddie sort of, again, wanting to sort of keep control of his band. I guess he sees this as another situation of like, here we go, history repeating. This guy is trying to dictate to me what I do with my band. And it was just this sort of I think it's a series of little niggles and a bit of posturing. And, Sammy said himself, he said, like, I got a bit cocky, and he said I also got a bit comfortable. But I was like, he said, look, everything had, gone like magic, for the whole time. And I sort of thought, these guys can't do this without me. This is now Van Halen, that was then. This is now, obviously, Dave, by that point, he's, come out of the blocks like a rocket with Eat 'Em and Smile, but had, his trajectory had definitely dipped, at that point. So, there wasn't much talk of like, hey, let's get David Lee Roth back. After sort of, OU812, people had got accustomed to this thing. I mean, and as much as people could love the old era, there wasn't anybody looking at Van Halen then and thinking, well, these guys have run their race with this. They just were going up and up and up. So,
because that was one of the thoughts, though, was that Ray Daniels takes over as the manager, the former Rush manager, and that maybe he's the one who wanted seeing the big Kiss reunion in '96, and he's the one who wanted all that to happen. But I don't know, he kind of got an unfair deal on that. That really wasn't so, right? He wasn't looking for that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Ray Daniels, I think, is sort of he's a convenient scapegoat for some of that stuff because he was Alex's brother-in-law. And, sort of people saw him as this big sort of Svengali that was coming in trying to sort of mold things in some sort of Machiavellian way. But I mean, I don't know Ray Daniels at all. I've never spoke to Ray Daniels, but, Ray Daniels worked with Rush forever. He wasn't exactly a guy who was pushing, if you're working with a band that's sort of idiosyncratic and that unique, he let Rush be Rush, however they chose to be. Highly unlikely that he would have come into a hugely successful operation and said, yeah, but how about we strip all that away and go back to, I mean, that would seem insane in business terms, because as much as the magic was there with Dave, Van Halen had surpassed him on every sort of commercial level. So the idea of going back to a guy whose star is now fading, undeniably, would seem like an insane move, really. So I think it was, more down to sort of, I say, that clash of personalities and that sort of idea of like two, alpha males butting heads and neither of them wanting to be the one who stepped away. I mean, sometimes with these sort of fallouts, it's not, people talk about it, it's not like an argument over like one chord in a song or like somebody not getting their chorus used. It's like, it's something really banal, like, where somebody's a camera shot in a video or who's been allowed to wear that jacket that night or, some pathetic or, who got the first dip in the guacamole. These tiny little inconsequential things that sort of just build and build. And it's, one thing that sort of snaps somebody and you're like, well, why are you falling out with that? Like, that's nothing. Of course it's nothing, but it's 10 years of nothing, maybe.
The book by Brad Talinsky and Chris Gill, Eruption Conversations with Eddie Van Halen, they interviewed Ray Daniels, and basically Ray was saying, by the time I came in, there was really no way to fix it. The problems were big by that time. It's just that they weren't public. And so I think that plays into why people wanted to blame Ray Daniels, just because of the time. Like, oh, he comes into the band and everything falls apart.
Yeah, that would make sense.
It had run its course, which can happen. Usually bands, after 10, 11 years?
Yeah, I mean, people talk, somebody talked about like how bands really essentially have 6 or 7 years for their golden. I mean, you think about Led Zeppelin, they only really had that sort of, chunk of time. That's usually when a band's like absolutely on fire. And if you can get past that, great. But most bands don't. That's when they're absolutely in the zone. And it's very few who can sort of push it out to a 4-decade career.
So now we move into the Gary Cherone era, which is short. 1998, Van Halen 3 comes out. It went gold. So it wasn't what the previous albums were commercially. I don't think it's a bad album. I don't agree with those who say it's terrible, it's laughable, and I enjoy it, but it is not what people were expecting.
Yeah, well, what was unique about that album was that was the first album that Eddie wrote sober. That was the unique thing about it, and that's the album that I interviewed him on, and he couldn't have been more proud of those songs. He couldn't have been more proud of what he achieved. That he'd overcome his anxieties, he'd overcome the sort of, the mental blocks that had stopped him creating sober, all the sort of hang-ups. He'd got that out there, he'd got into a really good place, he was sober, and he felt that this was the best of Eddie Van Halen, as in terms of where he was. This was him, unfiltered, sort of blurred by, substances. It was like the real musician coming through, and he was so proud of those songs. And that album essentially was the dagger in the heart for Eddie, because the world turned its back, on the 10 million people who had bought 1984, the 10 million people who had bought Van Halen 1 didn't want to know. And there's a really interesting interview in Inside Magazine again, where Eddie's talking to a journalist. He's talking about how he's talking about how the thrill of hearing You Really Got Me on radio, and he like ran upstairs to his mom and dad's bedroom and like, Mom, Dad, we're on the radio. And he said, I still got that thrill every time, I heard all of our songs on the radio. But he said he couldn't get arrested at radio on that record. And it was almost like everybody turned his back on him at the exact point where he needed a bit of buoyancy, because he hadn't got the substances to give him that ego thing. He was raw and he was fragile, and he needed people to rally around. And I was reading an interview with a guy called Keith Buckley recently, who's in a band called Every Time I Die. And his band had literally just split because he sort of got sober, and then the other guys maybe couldn't adjust to how this new character was. And he said an interesting thing. He said, everybody wants to help until the moment where you sort of come out of the fog, and then they realize they don't know this person anymore, that they knew that person, and suddenly they're uncomfortable, and suddenly they realize that they need to adjust if they're going to be able to deal with this new reality. And I think that's a time where true friends are there for you. And I think for Eddie, literally, it was a betrayal from, obviously he didn't know every individual fan. He didn't know that Bob Makowski in Pensacola hadn't bought the album this time around. But en masse, all that the people who were there for him, his cheerleaders, biggest fans, literally turned their back and walked away. Whether it was to someone else or just went back to the old albums, went back to whatever. And I think that was the sort of the biggest betrayal and the biggest sort of setback of Eddie's life, really. I don't think it's anything compared. He never again released a full album of original material. He spiraled down from that point, as everyone knows, in a quite horrifying way. And it's not one of these people have got a horrible habit these days of, like, when something goes wrong with somebody like Amy Winehouse, they go, we are all complicit in her downfall. We were all there watching that. And, I'm not going to make one of those claims for Van Halen fans and that record going, well, we all were responsible, because that's not how it works in the real world. But I think that stung Eddie, that complete rejection at the point where he was, at his most, like I say, at his most raw, at his most human, at his most honest, and saying, like, this is me. And everyone's like, I don't want to know you. Where's the smiley guy? That's what you want, not Roger Waters, a piano ballad, pulling your heart out of your chest. That's uncomfortable. That's not what we're ready for. That's what we want from you. And that, I think, was a pretty brutal smackdown for Eddie, one which he essentially never recovered from on a sort of creative level, and maybe on an ego level.
Thankfully, he did return. 2007, we know Dave returns to the band. Wolfgang is now a huge part of this. And 2012's A Different Kind of Truth comes out. He gets past this dark period. By 2015, he's in great health. He's sober. He's kicking ass on stage. And Wolfgang's an important part of that. He gets his dad back out on the stage, back in the studio. And Eddie seemed to have a renewed love of life. Like, the smile on his face in the photos that he's with Wolfgang is different than the smile. He's legitimately happy in the old days when he's playing guitar, doing what he loves. But that smile he has on his face when he's looking at Wolfgang, that's a look that I think we can all recognize. I know that's the way my dad would look at me when he was proud of me. It's that certain smile, that different smile.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Sadly, there isn't a photo section there's two versions of this book. You've been referring to it as Eruption, which is the original sort of rest of the world title, but in the US, people will see it on the Van Halen store as Unchained. But there's no photo section in Chained, and there is a photo section in Eruption. And I sort of personally went through and I wanted the pictures to tell their own story. And there's a picture I have in there. There's a picture I have in here, which is sort of that thing you're talking about. And it's this picture. And it's, I don't know how well you can see that.
Yes.
And basically, that's exactly what you're talking about. And that's why I wanted it in the book, because it's Eddie with his arm around his boy, giving him a kiss on the cheek. And just, you can see the love in that. And that's the reason I wanted that in there, was that, again, a lot of people, someone had it in for Wolfie when he joined the band. And they obviously, because of the deep love they had for Michael Anthony. And there was this sort of sense of resentment that Wolfgang was there, because people didn't know the backstory, like you say, about him really G'ing up the band, about him pulling out those old demos and stuff to kind of get his dad fired up again. And Wolfgang's a hugely important part in that final chapter of Eddie's life. And that picture, to me, is sort of encapsulates everything you were talking about, that sort of absolute pride and love and just sort of contentment of where Eddie was at in life. And as sort of awful as the tragedy of Eddie's passing was, it's comforting on some level that the circle was kind of closed in the terms of what the songs were on that last record, and in terms of how happy and at peace Eddie was with himself and excited about where Wolfgang was going to take things next. I mean, there was an interview that he did with a journalist called, I think she was called Pauline Quex, and it was part of the Smithsonian sort of lectures, and it was titled How to Be an American, I think it was called. And obviously, talking about the Van Halen story as being the epitome of the American dream. These immigrants come over and literally sort of weave themselves into the fabric of the country, enhance the sort of the culture of the country, and become, a definitive sort of picture of, that sort of melting pot of America. And in that interview, towards the end of it, Pauline Quex references family, and Eddie sort of looks out in the audience and says, Alex is here, and he said, Wolfgang, and he goes, you're not ready for what this kid has got up his sleeve. You think what I did was amazing. This guy's going to blow you away. And I guess Wolfgang's maybe, 15, 16 at that point. The pride was there, and it seems like Eddie was ready to pass the baton, to pass the torch, to the greatest love of his life, his child. And so, while it's horrible that Eddie still isn't with us, I think people, sometimes when someone passes and they've had a good life and they were in a good place when they passed away, that is one consolation, I guess that people who loved Eddie can take, that he was in such content, he's in a really good, maybe the most sort of at peace with himself as he'd ever been in his life.
I think it's fitting we end with a quote from Eddie's big brother Al on what was Eddie's 67th birthday last month. Alex posted to the band's website, quote, "Hey Ed, happy birthday. May your light never dim. Love you, miss you, and by the way, Wolf is killing it." Awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, you get a little choked up reading that, man. Woo. Yeah, I mean, that's it. His light will never dim. I would say 100 years from now, people are going to be talking about Eddie. Like you talk about Beethoven and Mozart and all those guys. If we have it our way.
Yeah. And I'm saying, again, like we said earlier, who knows what music we haven't heard from Eddie Van Halen. I mean, that's something, to keep people in anticipation. We're never going to hear a new Van Halen record, but we might hear new Eddie Van Halen music, if, as and when, maybe Wolfgang's living his life, might be 15 years before he gets around to this. It might be 30 years before he gets around to this. Yep. But I can't imagine that we will never hear new original music from Eddie Van Halen. I just can't imagine that's going to be the case. Fingers crossed. Unchained, the Eddie Van Halen story, is out now through Permuted Press, and you can get your copy through the Van Halen store at vanhalenstore.com. Paul, any websites, social media pages you want to get out there? I actually don't do any social media whatsoever. If people go to the Van Halen news desk, that's good enough for me. Van Halen store, that's good enough for me. Hey. You'll find a lot more that's in their interest than worrying about what I had for breakfast on Twitter. That works for us. Van Halen News Desk, VHND.com. Well, Paul, again, thanks so much. I know you've done quite a few interviews. I'm glad we finally got a chance to talk about the great Van Halen and the man himself, Eddie Van Halen. Thank you very much, Rick. Thanks to Paul Brannigan for taking us through his book, Unchained, an Eddie Van Halen story. And make sure you pick up a copy of the book at the Van Halen store, online at vanhalenstore.com. Make sure you subscribe to Booked on Rock at Spreaker or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. We're on Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Spotify, TuneIn, YouTube, and more. Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/BookedOnRockPodcast, on Twitter at BookedOnRock. The email address, thebookedonrockpodcast@gmail.com. If you're a publisher or author of a book on rock and you want to be on the podcast, send me an email or just contact me through our website, bookedonrock.com. Also want to give a big thanks to Mark Slade from Twisted Pulp Magazine for featuring me in the latest issue number 14. They not only mention the Booked on Rock podcast, but also the Van Halen News Desk. Pick up a copy at screamingeyepress.com. If you're into pulp horror, noir, sci-fi, and fantasy stories and comics, this is the magazine for you. I'm Eric Senich. Thanks for listening, and join me again next time for another brand new episode of Booked on Rock.